when you were talking about the broader experience of having worked in branding and marketing and supply chain and this kind of smorgasbord of commercial experience that I've ended up having by chance, or was it? That's brought me to this place where I get sightlines through things
Yeah.
that are a bit unique. And we were having a conversation yesterday about some of the stuff that you guys are doing at East Denver, where you're actually able to ingrain the the validation of the credit that's being created at source point straight into the token. And then I was talking about how for us that was super important, because what we could do is we could bind that all the way up the chain to the client, because one of the key ways of adding value to carbon, and one of the hard problems that we're trying to solve in the regenerative space right now, is how do you create value beyond carbon? Like, how do you layer that? And I'm part of a process called the Ecological Benefits Framework, which is all about that. And it's about how we can create a framework for equity, air, water, soil kind of and biodiversity protection into it.
Right.
So we were talking about, okay, how do we, at the sales end, when we're selling a credit, how can we justify a premium price point for a credit? And it's being able to show in that credit easily and simply, to reduce the due diligence overhead on the client side, that this carbon credit comes with all of these other demonstrable co-benefits. And then one of the interesting things was, as we were talking about that, I was thinking about how if we could ingrain that at the ground level, when the credit or the token is created. In our instance, that might be, for example, we're looking at apex predator methodologies to be able to identify and demonstrate biodiversity pyramid health in areas. So if you had a nature camera on territory, for example, that snapped a grizzly bear in a geographic area that carbon credit came from, you could actually ingrain that into the token. You could take that all the way up to the point where it's sold to the client. And then if the client has bought into our model and actually holds value in the ecosystem, and therefore is the recipient of credits from that ecosystem, you could ingrain right the way from that grizzly bear being snapped on the ground, right the way up, not just into their credit, but that credit going into their business and then being demonstrated as on their website as an immediate piece of value or due diligence for the credits they've bought, to counterbalance any greenwashing allegations that they might have, right? Because they can suddenly demonstrate it. And you can build that line of sight all the way through, because Web3 is amazing for creating this kind of line of sight ground truthing for assets that come on stream and then get distributed or sold. And I think that's super powerful.
This is really cool. So I was just thinking about it in accounting terms, because I've been, my last interview was with Bill McCarthy, who built the REA accounting methodology back in the day.
Right.
And, but also kind of related to a lot of the economists and accountants that I've been reading works of over the last several years. And, we all know, oh, externalities, right? These are the things that never get captured. In a way,
Yes.
what you just said sort of flips it on its head in a way. And instead of looking at them as the negative externalities that don't count, you're actually looking at the positive context, because you're adding it in at the value side of
Yes.
the asset. So it's sort of like, well, the degradation of these things would be considered the externalities, but the
Yes.
existence of these things, or the positive context, being included, as you're
Yes.
saying, and embedded into the asset value itself, because you're talking
Yes.
about a regenerative, you know,
And you're
regenerative
creating,
value.
exactly, and you're creating a counterbalance
Right.
to the extractive impact, values and impacts. You know, another conversation I've had a lot recently with people in this space, exploring this space, has been around the realization that we're in a kind of unipolar economic world that is entirely centric on extraction. And all the transactional mediums we have are kind of founded in that. The US dollar is founded in extraction. If money's a lean on energy and debt is a lean on future energy, well, actually the US dollar and US dollar debt is actually backed by extracted fossil fuel energy. And so therefore debt is a commitment to that. So we're in this kind of unipolar economic world. And nature isn't living nature isn't represented in it. It's all dead and extracted nature. And in fact, the only way of creating value flow in the current system into protected nature is by literally burning the transactional medium, burning money through philanthropy. You're having to give it away. Whereas the whole point of the regenerative economic space is, hey, we need a duopole world here, with two-pole world, to create a counterbalance. It's not about replacing extractive economics. It's about creating a balanced counterbalance to it, so that, you know, we are human. We are destroyer and creator. We are both. You know, it's about creating a double pole economic world that better represents the fact that nature, living nature, needs a seat at the economic table in the same way that dead nature currently has. I mean, in fact, we need to understand that nature doesn't just need a seat at the economic table. We need to acknowledge it is the table, and it's the air in the room, right? The human economic system is a subsidiary of the natural economic system, and yet our current financial paradigm, which is so extractively centric, suggests it's the other way round, which of course is crazy. and this is where Web3 is so powerful, because we're not trying to build regenerative products. We're trying to build, what we need to build is an entire regenerative stack, an entire economic ecosystem that counterbalances the extractive ecosystem. Because, and that's, these Web3 tools and everything that's around now is amazing, because it's basically speeds up the process it takes to financialize new value flows and recognize new value flows and hold value in new types of asset, because it's revolutionizing financial products. So, you know, you wouldn't want to build a new economy built on regeneration with the old tool set. You need to be using a new tool set that would be like trying to start a music distribution company now and going, we've got this new technology, CDs. It would just be a crazy backward situation, wouldn't it? You know, and although the TradFi world, often there's a bit of a shunning of you know, Web3 or and refi kind of tools, a lot of that's down to actually they want to use them in the way they want to use them, with a kind of maintain central control, right? You know, central bank digital currencies is using all the benefits of Web3, but without decentralizing the control and the ownership and the power, which is the whole amazing thing about Web3, right? Riffing a bit on the need to build a whole stack. And that's the, you know, the big challenge in regenerative finance is if we build it using the tool set of the extractive stack, it's never quite gonna properly compete with it, because it's using the wrong value flow mediums and stuff.
So, but I'm gonna back up, because why don't you give, since we're doing an interview, why don't you give a brief introduction to yourself, kind of an elevator intro to your work. You kind of referenced a little bit of background in the first comment, but tease that out a little bit, understand a little bit more about, you know, what got you here, and you know, what's been your journey.
Well, my journey was very much not in the regenerative space. It didn't start in conservation, didn't start in nature protection anyway. My background, very much commercial. Started academically in technology and information technology, particularly information science, and back in the days when it was a new thing for business to have to start to consider it, where, you know, my academic background was, how does business start to use these new amazing information tools? But then I went into a brand and marketing sort of piece of my career for 10 years, working for big companies, Yamaha, Motor Europe, people like that. But I got heavily involved in managing and controlling the use of brand by multiple entities in a network, in a distributor and a sales network particularly, became an area of specialization for, like, you know, if we're going to implement a brand strategy, how can we maintain and coordinate its use and control at ground level across, you know, the world, actually, in different languages and different geographical spaces. So that became quite a kind of area for me. Then I kind of diversified through investing in one of my suppliers, who I was fascinated, because I was a kind of helping people with their brands and product direction, but got frustrated that I didn't make any of my own products. So I then invested in one of my suppliers, who had the opportunity to tender for a physical manufacturing and product supply role. But again, the novel element of how that business started was that the the large company that was trying to control its brand use on its physical consumables in store across the world was shipping its product hugely inefficiently, because if you don't fill a 40-foot container and you've got a low value product, suddenly 20-30% of your product cost is actually your shipping, because you've
Yeah.
shipped 25% of air. So that business started because we built a e-commerce shop that filled a 40-foot container. So you only shipped your product when you were full. And we brought the cost down of the product for that customer by 20-30%. I then got involved in some interesting supply chain side, building up manufacturing supply chains, and Far Eastern manufacturing, global distribution. I then got involved with warehousing and distribution at a local level, holding that. So I ended up with a really great wide set of experience across the whole business supply chain. And obviously, being our own businesses as well, I've got good experience of, you have to be your own financial director when you're a small business, right? So you understand balance sheets and you understand P&L and all of the and working with big companies, how they work, their divisions, their siloing, how their different departments work. So you end up with this kind of mad smorgasbord experience. I then personally, 8 out of the last 10 years, lived with my family in British Columbia on the west coast of Canada.
Mhm.
And alongside my commercial journey, I developed just a deep love for nature, and particularly the kind of rainforests of the Pacific Northwest. And so in 2017, when I was lucky enough to be able to kind of exit the operational side of my business, I was then working strategically on, okay, what can I get involved with? This crazy commercial smorgasbord that I do have, how can I leverage that into doing something that's going to be meaningful for my kids and for this impending meta crisis that's clearly growing as a big dark cloud on the horizon? That's when I started to get very interested in Web3, because again, I realized that unless we solve money and how we hold money and transact value in the system, this meta crisis isn't going to go away, because ultimately the way in which we create new money creates this ballooning growth dependent and imperative economical paradigm that just ultimately puts continual pressure on the planet.
Right.
And when we untethered all of our money from any planetary boundaries in the 70s, and we actually then pegged it on extractive energy, as we talked about earlier, I just saw this as a never-ending bubble that could only collapse onto this beautiful planet around us. And that's when I came across Holochain, and I came into that sphere, and obviously got very interested in supporting the growth and the opportunity for you guys to grow. And one of the things that hugely attracted me to Holochain right from the start was the biomimicry of the structure. I see that structure, and then I walk outside and I see that structure. It's all around us. It's how nature works. It's decentralized, but at the same time, it has a coordination that's at a low level, and it builds and it creates individual characterizations at the same time as being held in a whole too. So, but the end result of all of that was I was then on the west coast of Canada when logging protests were starting to occur at a place called Fairy Creek on the west of Vancouver Island. And I was deeply concerned about that. This was a systemic problem. This is the extractive economic forces bearing down on the last stands of old growth forests. And these are forests that I had camped in. I've spent time with my kids in those forests, and their ecosystems of just, unparalleled beauty and importance, clearly. And yet there was no way to hold value in them. One of the things that sparked me and sparked the idea that ultimately has become Qualla was to see over $1 million raised on GoFundMe by the protesters. And I was like, well, the entrepreneur in me sees that as a market research piece. That's $1 million trying to find its way to those forests as a living resource. Where's the bucket that's catching that? Where's the framework that's can hold that and create a proper economic counterbalance to the logging industry that's trying to cut them down? And what I realized was there wasn't one. There was no, as an investor, I couldn't go and buy shares in a living forest to counterbalance the economic powers of people buying shares and buying lumber in the logging company. And that really was the kind of genesis of the conceptual idea for what has ultimately become Qualla. And what we're doing at Qualla is turning truly at-risk forests into protected forests that are returned into the stewardship of the indigenous land title holders for the area. And then we create a partnership investment vehicle where anybody globally can invest and hold value in that forest as a living forest asset. And because we've created a truly protected forest area from a previously at-risk forest area, we create an additionality which allows us to create regenerative commodities, i.e. carbon credits, eco credits from that protected forest area that then create a revenue stream. So suddenly we've created a polar opposite to the extractive industry's asset, and we've created a regenerative asset that can generate regenerative returns. But it's not philanthropy.
Right.
It's genuine
Business.
economic model, right? So we're not using the scraps from the extractive economic table to protect the nature, and that could be scraps philanthropy or scraps tax revenues from a province that makes all its money from extraction. This is a genuine alternative. We're buying, and we're not buying the forests. This is a very important key to what we're doing. The clever trick that the 150-year-old colonial extractive economy's trick is it doesn't own the land. The land's public. It's Crown territory in British Columbia. In fact, most of the forests globally are on public land. Canada, 90+%. Russia, 100%. Brazil, 80+%. Public land. That's public land. It's often in contradiction to what's often now being recognized indigenous land title. But the land itself is public. You can't buy it. And the extractive industry doesn't buy it. It buys the right to extract. It owns the contractual relationship between humanity and that ecosystem that says, I'm going to kill you. That's the asset that's actually realized in the extractive industry. They own a logging license, they own a tree farm license, they own a right to extract. The regenerative stack has no counter to that right now. That's what we're building. So we're purchasing extractive rights. We're converting them to protect, regenerate, and steward rights that are then held by the indigenous land title holders. And that then becomes a regenerative asset, not the commodity, the credits, the eco services that that ecosystem provides is like a counter to the lumber. The lumber is countered by the carbon credits or biodiversity credits. We can get onto that. And then but the right to extract is in this new form factor that we're building, this new framework.
So I'm just gonna take it to a different part of the world for a second, because I want to understand it as a structure that, in a pattern sort of thing. And
Yes.
Sometimes it's good to have multiple examples.
Yes.
So roll back, I don't know, 3 years, 5 years, and we were all just looking at space pictures of the Amazon burning. Right. These forests in the Amazon that were burning sounds like you're saying these were all on public lands primarily.
A lot of them were, 80+% of Brazil is public land.
And so they were burning because people wanted more pasture land, right? That's my understanding of the economic mechanisms and dynamics happening right there, because the pasture land allows them to have cattle. The cattle is what allows the locals who are living in this environment to have an economic activity that gives them their livelihoods. And so it's not that they want to burn forests, it's that they want economic livelihoods.
Yes.
Right. I mean, let's not 100%. Make the people who are living in these situations the bad guy necessarily.
Totally.
Even though it has the massive effects that we're talking about. So what I don't really grok, or what I don't really understand in this example, is do these activities, does the burning of the Amazon, is that coming from a license to use the Amazon as pasture land, or is that just a action taken because people are desperate? So I don't know the story there, and I'm guessing you probably are more tapped into this than I am.
I'm a little more tapped in, but I wouldn't want to talk too much in detail about that because It's not that I don't know the specifics, but I do kind of know the big, most general thing, which you
Yeah,
hit on, which is that ultimately these remote communities are looking to partake in the economic and in an economic activity, whether that's cutting down the trees, and whether that's public land that's they have a tenure on or it's not, or whether it's, I mean, extractive tenure is a common colonial structure, so it is repeated in a lot of places around the world that
yeah,
were colonies. But ultimately, that framework's not as important as the intent. The intent is these communities have an option to get involved in an economic activity, and it usually involves extraction or destruction of nature to create
right.
some kind of, like you said, arable land, etc. But what I can do is I can take that same if you step back out, it's the same thing whether it's in Brazil or whether it's in British Columbia.
Right.
These remote communities in British Columbia are faced with the same binary option. They have a binary option to extract from the forests that are around them and partake in the economic, miracle, or the binary choices that they conserve. And at the moment, that's not really monetized, and it's certainly not an export industry for the province. It doesn't generate tax revenue. So, and we often talk about if philanthropy is the alternative to extractive economics, the math just is never going to work, because you're fundamentally, you have to give up locally. The cost is all local. So traditional conservation makes British Columbia poorer. It's giving up tax revenues, it's giving up export revenues, and that's at a provincial level. And at a local level, they're giving up jobs in remote communities. What we're doing is building an economic counterbalance for regeneration, which actually says, okay, do we go toe to toe with extraction? That's pretty tough right now from a value flow point of view. But you know what? When you go toe to toe against traditional conservation, we are leaps. We're actually making BC richer, right? So fundamentally, and also the community. So suddenly the community is an option. It's not a binary option between conservation, which is often more in line with those indigenous communities' way of life and thinking too. So they're actually having to go against their own cultural
Yeah.
background in some cases to do the extraction. So what we're doing is we're creating an alternative option that's economic, that allows it, to have a value flow. It's an export market. Carbon credits are created and generated and sold to companies all around the world potentially. So suddenly you're just realizing an economic flow that's alternative, and you're just creating a motivation to regenerate as opposed to a motivation to destroy. And how that then translates into other biomes and other bioregions will be different in every step, but the
Yeah.
fundamental idea of creating an economic activity that's based on regeneration counteracts that very base requirement to generate economic value.
Yeah, I can get it now. I was trying to connect the dots about the participants, right? And I
Mm.
like the way you kind of include the folks who are living on the land, whether those are indigenous or not. I mean, it's still the local communities, right? That's really the point we're making.
100%. And
There are
I
local
go,
communities that have something at stake because they are there in this space. And yet this space has an effect to far more than that, just that local community. It has an effect to us at a global level. It has
100%.
is the systemic effect, right, beyond the region even, but it has region effects and it has global effects. I mean, let's not when Canada is burning and the heat waves are coming up into the middle of the country, I mean, that's having a massive cost
Yes.
across, the whole region.
Yeah.
And it's not just painful for the people who are losing a house that got burned down because a fire
100%.
got, underway. It's a lot of other industries that are affected, a lot of other livelihoods that are affected over the course of months.
And I think you've hit on a couple of key things there. I was saying traditional conservation has a local cost because it's given up local tax and export economy, and yet extraction has a global cost that's not factored into the extractive value that they realize locally. And again, going back to Web3 and the regenerative space as a whole, it's about recognizing those value flows and finding ways to make them all work. So that's key. One of the things I want to also just sort of double click on was you're talking about the inclusion of the local community. I think it's more than inclusion. We're Indigenous led, and we're Indigenous majority owned, and we always will be. And the way that we are is dynamic as we grow, and I'll talk about that in a second. But I think it's more than including the community; it's making them centric to this.
Mm.
So, Indigenous knowledge systems are massively important because they are of place, right? They are of geographic understanding. It's what indigeneity is. It's being of place. And humanity's current economic systems have this great love for top-down shoving of systems and processes, but actually the magic of a regenerative model that works is to be able to maintain autonomy and independence on a project level at the lower level of the network, because that's where all the really good knowledge is of how to really interact with these bioregions. You know, the colonial structure landed in the New World to Europeans and then ripped up forests because they weren't doing anything productive and stuck European, farming practices into it, completely not understanding that they were ripping up actually agricultural crops that were being farmed in a very different way by indigenous communities in the New World. So I think the magic of really powerful regenerative systems is not inclusion of the local community, it's centric of the local community. And that's what these amazing decentralized Web3 projects and products can do, is create coordination of individual projects, but not at the expense of autonomy and empowerment of those activating on a community level.
Well, in even just going back to the philanthropies models that we've seen fail over and over and over, where they fail is at scale, because what works in one place doesn't work every place. You literally do need to have different projects, different specific activities taking place on the ground in different places, even if the solution or the problem sound the same in the abstract. It doesn't follow that when you take the one solution from, place A
British Columbia.
Yeah, British Columbia, and place it into place B in the Amazon, that specific set of structures will actually work, because it might be a governance structure that doesn't work for the local community. It might be anything, right? I mean, like, there's a lot of aspects of what these things do. And we've seen that. I mean, the problem with large philanthropy right now is that the intention by the funders so much is to replicate and scale, replicate and scale. And they start from one example instead of knowing that their model needs to start as a distributed model, and that all the different ways that it works are actually of value. We're not just, their job isn't to take and move something from one place to another, but instead to listen to what's working in the different places and actually make sure that those can be coordinated, and that if they have needs at a global or intersection layer, that they're able to sort that out for them.
100%. I mean, the existing paradigm has built up with you scale by repeating. Repeat, right? Like, if it's production line, it's factory, it's basically
mechanistic.
Once you've mastered it, you do that same thing as many times as you can with as little variation as possible, because you're reducing your balance sheet asset investment cost per unit sold, kind of thing. It's that way of thinking. And yet what we need is to have systems that recognize scale and then we have degrees of coordination on an individual level, but then huge amounts of autonomy, because that's how you reverse the polarity on colonialism and top-down domination structures as well, right? That's how we unpick that whole process. And if we're going to build another pole, it needs to not just be like extraction versus regeneration. It needs to also be colonial versus decolonial, centralized versus decentralized. It's finding all the tension points between those. And these tool sets that we've got enable that in a really fantastic way. And I think another key thing is, one of philanthropy's big problems right now, or one of the big challenges right now, is the water drops are too big. That was a phrase that was used recently by somebody with me. It's like the amount of money that we're trying to deploy is simply too large to then also be able to meet the mandates that we have to empower communities at a local level. Because how do you do that? How do you have a water pipe that filters down into lots of small pipes, not flooding out where it hits? And yet, again, this is important to note, I think, that there is hugely good intention right now in people trying to deploy capital in into projects that are earth focused, nature positive, and community focused at ground level. And that is one of their challenges is how do we solve that big drop of water problem? And I think it is this ground up and top down simultaneously system that allows us to encode equity and empowerment at a local level and create horizontal and vertical learning distribution structures for learning and understanding that then say, well, actually, yes, if you drop that big drop of water, we can break it up. And that's a big part of what we're doing in the way we're building our network. And we touched on it earlier. We're indigenous led and majority owned. Well, what does that mean? Well, indigeneity is being of place. So right now for us, our pilot's in British Columbia. So being authentic to that right now is working with our British Columbian founding partners to establish our pilot. As we expand provincially, chances are that what indigenous led and majority owned means in that area will stay. There'll be fractions of it, reflections of it, but it'll be relatively similar. And we've built, again, using Web3 Toolkit, we've built an ownership structure and a value reflow structure that as a coordinating entity, a project or a network of projects that we've created a value ownership chain where as our network grows, they become part of our centralized ownership structure. So we have an immediate value flow mechanism back down to the grassroots. If we then go and take that model to somewhere like Brazil, we hold that model as well. So suddenly what it means to be indigenous led and majority owned in that bioregion will be different. But we're building a framework to learn on the ground, to integrate to what's needed at that area in a new way. And for us, the magic is not to tell anybody how to do it. It's to build a framework to be able to interface with all of the existing knowledge systems and create economies of scale that is not contradictory to and power of coordination that's not contradictory to that empowerment of every individual project and individual community. And by doing that, we create a mechanism which not only then creates a regenerative counterbalance to extraction, but a decolonial counterbalance to a colonial mindset. And there are a lot of people trying to deploy capital very responsibly. There are people, perhaps through naivety, that are trying to deploy capital in a very colonial structure. That's the kind of green colonialism that we're seeing, the natural asset companies. We will buy the land, we will dictate how this land is regenerated, and it's all a top-down structure. And I think we're at an interesting time in regenerative finance and economics right now that if we do this the right way, we can do it without replicating all of the downsides of how extractive systems expanded and colonized the world. But there's a point where it's an important time for us right now to do that in the right way.
Do you think there's an opening for the transition of the thinking? I mean, I understand and actually I have a lot of compassion for really that people do things with a lot of good intent and replicate patterns that are negative or have a lot of negative implications.
Yes.
For me, that's I don't know. I don't want to, I'm not fond of having that be a big make wrong game so much as looking at, well, what are the good parts that can be pulled out? Where are the opportunities for, are the openings for shifting the mindsets, you know, assuming that our mindset, that the way we're talking about it is the right way, right? I mean, like some of this stuff is just a moral assessment and not everybody agrees with those things, and it takes time to change when it's about ethics and culture. So I don't expect it to all move quickly, but are there openings, I guess, is my real question. And where do you see those openings for transformations to be happening with some of those organizations?
I think what we're really talking about is the optionality of being able to hold value in new ways. Like there is a demand for people to be able to hold value in nature in a new way, but there is just no outlet for that right now.
Right.
It's like Tesla. When Tesla launched, the car industry suddenly realized that they had missed a huge amount of swelling up demand in consumers for an alternative to fossil fuel cars, but just nobody had delivered on that concept. Tesla came along and went, we're just about electric cars. And then suddenly they're the most valuable company in the world. Now, what Tesla did was tap into what was plainly pent up level of demand for humanity to have an alternative. And I think we're at the same point with regenerative economics. And I think even ESG funds, in my mind, are a classic example of that. ESG funds are under scrutiny for putting money into projects that are not in line with ESG principles.
Yep.
Now, some people are going, that's because ESG funds are rubbish. I don't think that's true. I think they're actually a victim of their own success. People are desperately ringing their investment guys and going, take my money out of anything that's negative and extractive, put it somewhere better. Okay, we'll put it into the ESG fund. ESG funds are running out of places to put the money, but they still have to put it somewhere. So what they do instead is they've had to slack the hurdles for projects to get in to be ESG qualifying. So I think what they actually identify is a huge pent up demand for something new, new ways to hold value. Like I was, how do I hold value in a living forest? There's no way.
Right.
And I think what we're also finding is we're talking to companies who are in the same place. There's been reports out recently, haven't there? Because a lot of people talk about, oh, are carbon credits a way to, maintain status quo? And actually, there's been a load of reports recently done that have shown that the companies most investing time in buying carbon credits are also the same companies that are very consciously mitigating their own emissions. So it's literally like companies trying to do things in the right way are doing more than anybody else. So and I've also come across situations very recently where not only are they trying to mitigate their own emissions and buy credits and do business responsibly, because businesses are made up of people and people are realizing we need to be more responsible. I've actually come across big companies now in extractive spaces who are so desperate that there isn't any service providers in the regenerative economy, like we're in an infancy, that they are actually trying to carry out nature-based kind of protection projects themselves, and they're fumbling around with it because guess what, they're a mining company. They're
Yeah, and they
not.
just don't have that capacity
Yeah.
or knowledge, skill.
Yes. And what a commercial business does usually when it needs to buy something in an area where it has no commercial skill is it buys it from a commercial partner who has the skill in that area. But of course, we're in this nascent process right now where there aren't people in that space because it's a new space. So, that's the space that we're kind of stepping into. So in that instance, they've been connected with us because they go, oh, thank goodness, this isn't our skill set. We want to be responsible, but we want to buy it from somebody who, frankly, is more credible in the space for doing it because we're a mining company. So, actually, there's this there's this great void, I think, at the moment that needs to be filled by people building in this space, building regenerative products to sell to companies that and individuals who want to invest in new things and companies that are actually trying to carry out their business in a responsible manner. We get an awful lot of binary, don't we, in the world? Corporations are bad. Well, no, corporations aren't bad as a whole. I run a B Corp certified supply chain company. Please don't compare me to, to any other business because my intent and the business's intent and our shareholders in that business's intent is very different to many other operators. And, that's why there's this super exciting space evolving around that where companies, individuals are all trying to find ways and the vision and the way I see things developing is just entrepreneurs realizing that, stepping into the space, building new things. Web3
Oh,
toolkits are great for that because you can do it
right.
super quick. We can prototype a financial product and get it out there amazingly quickly. Brilliant. That's what we need if we're building the whole stack. So that's where it gets exciting. I think one of the bigger challenges for us as an industry as we grow is, and everybody talks about it all the time, don't we? We need systemic change. Well, guess what? Systemic change often needs legislative change. It's not just about economic structures that we need to unpick and counterbalance. It's legislative structures. And I think one of the biggest challenges in this area right now is that traditional venture and traditional kind of commercial, investment, for profit business
Yes.
investment finds it very hard to fund anything that has got a government timeline in it or a government decision. And that's our 2 year plus origin story. It's not been concepting the financial product that we're building. It's actually been creating the real world legislative structure to enable us to actually make the product that we want to make, because it's currently legislatively not possible for us to make the regenerative project because of the level of capture that the extractive economics have on the governance and the contracts and the legislations around land use and tenure. That's been the piece that's hard. But as a result, you can't, there's no funding or very few funding avenues that you can use to actually develop that.
Fascinating. Well, I think you were getting into something I wanted to kind of move and I'll restate it, and maybe you can um I just want to dig in a little bit more, I guess, because what I'm curious is that sounds like you're talking about blockages for information flows, for
Mm.
for architectures, for what actually gets in the way of value flow evolution.
I think just to dig a bit deeper on what we were just talking about there, actually, when we said earlier, the existing systems always they thrive on doing the same thing over and over again. They're actually kind of anti-change. They are pro status quo. A lot of the systems of governance and finance we have, it's quite hard to create change in. And we've come face to face with that as we've kind of evolved through our origin story. And it's just very hard for existing structures of legislation to move without really good justification. Certainly hard to move quickly. And yet, of course, this crisis is something that needs to move quickly. And so I think that is a big area of, a big blockage for being able to realize certain value elements. You can't realize a value element in a new way if you can't legally hold a structure in a certain with a new kind of mechanism.
Interesting. Is
Yeah.
there a like I know we were talking about some of the drawbacks of the large not-for-profits trying to be accountable for all this change, but is there a role perhaps um for them in the catalyzation or testing space of this? Because like you were saying, if
Yes.
it requires policy level change at one in for it to really work, does that mean you can't test it in small spaces with a certain amount of funding? I'm
I
just
think
curious.
it, yeah, I think you've hit a couple of really important points there. I think that is an opportunity space for, NGOs and philanthropic is okay. This is something that needs longer term governmental shift. That's not a profitable endeavor. So this is where that should happen, to kind of push the door open for systemic change through
Right.
there. I think one of the challenges currently is that a lot of philanthropic organizations have a hesitation to put money behind entities that will then ultimately become profit making. So
Right.
So
Right.
I mean, not all of them, but and there's a lot of evolution going on right now that people are realizing, oh, hang on a minute, if we're going to really create systemic change, we need to work out how new types of businesses can come about. So there are funds doing it, but it is still hard, and obviously the demand for those funds is quite high because it's a genuine space that's tricky.
Do you mind if I keep you for another 10 minutes?
Absolutely no problem at all.
Okay, great. Because I love this conversation. I can't. So, first of all, thank you for doing this with me. I have wanted to be having this conversation with you. I know we've had little bits of it here and there throughout the
Yeah,
past years, but I want people to hear more of what you're saying. And I don't see it out there in the world in quite the way that you say it. And so I'm very happy that I get to be in the dialogue that we can then take and share out to a degree. Um, I think that you think differently from others and others who share the same commitments. I hear what you're saying. Um, lots of people are talking about systems change, lots of people talking about regeneration. Not a lot of people are bringing the down to earth so to speak financialization to this conversation in the way you are. And it's sort of a meeting people where they are, like, because the rest of the world understands that financialization side of things. Um, and a bunch of the people who are in positions of power, especially, understand the financialization aspect of it. And so I've been struggling for years and years trying to get and to me this is like the screaming out into the world that where nobody's listening that economists have been doing about externalities for years and years and years, and
yeah,
finally this looks like somebody saying it in language that can be heard with sort of something with sort of an implementation that can be modeled essentially
yeah.
to make a difference. And so I love that. It sounds real. It meets my needs of like having something be like, grounded and real, um,
Tangible.
tangible. Absolutely. So that's all part of me saying thank you. Thank you.
And thank you back. I'm super grateful for you reaching out and wanting to talk to me about it because I'm passionate about it. You don't see a lot of me out there right now. To be honest with you, we've had to be kind of in a sort of stealthy mode of the project's been a little bit low key for a while, but now is
Yeah,
the time where we need to talk about it.
but the thing is this isn't just about one project in the world.
Yeah.
You're thinking in a way that people need to hear about. You're thinking in a way that connects dots. And I want people in my communities to be inspired by some of the things that you're saying. I mean, that's just fundamentally it, because they're movers and shakers, they're connectors, they're able to work on across and around the capital markets and the fund and the regeneration spaces. And
Mm.
they should be hearing about these kinds of models. They should be thinking that you're cutting across. How can people think newly about this, right? So kind of related to all that,
Yeah.
I want to drill down a little bit. Are there edges or unsolved problems still in the way that you approach these things? What, not just what's blocking it or what's going to take time, but are there unsolved issues, unsolved problems in this domain?
I think one of the biggest unsolved problems is really how is activity, commercial activity in the world going to be able to recognize and counterbalance in a quantitative way its impact on nature. Carbon, I basically, how do we go beyond carbon? Carbon is not the be all and end all, but it's quite quantifiable and it's fairly fungible. And you can argue about the accuracy of it, but having had a background that's touched into the, being involved in the financial side of businesses, if you have a commercial objective to be net zero, you can get some people in from KPMG, again, going back to the kind of specializations of businesses. You get the people in from KPMG who get their calculators out. I was going to say pencil, but that's a bit old school, isn't it? They get their calculators out, they get the spreadsheets out, and they can work out this is your emissions. And I've got friends and family who are financial directors, big companies, and this is what they've done. They've employed the specialists who've come in and said, your carbon footprint is X. And they've gone, because we don't want to be irresponsible. So we're now going to go out and mitigate. We're going to offset that. And also, guess what? You've just created a cost base in the business because suddenly they've got a commercial objective being net zero. They know they have to offset X number of tons. So they now need to buy X number of tons of offsets. You've created a commercial incentive to mitigate emissions simultaneously, right? Because that's what businesses do. That's what finance departments do. They go, Bill, you've got a cost in your department of 2,000 carbon credits a year. You down 20% by next quarter, otherwise you're out. That's just normal commercial motivations. The challenge with things like the wider how do we deal with biodiversity impact of a business is much more difficult for a business to quantify. And again, it's not their skill set, right? You can't go to a big company and go, right, work out what your biodiversity impact is and how you're going to mitigate it. They'll be like, well, how, what? And the TFND report came out recently. Task Force for Nature Impact Disclosures, I think is the
okay. And where is that located?
I mean, it's a global report, and it was basically how, in a nutshell, very layman's terms, nutshell, how is business impacting nature, and how important is it that there's disclosures and mitigation of that by the businesses, and how can we make those externalities internalities for the businesses to be business more responsible. The biggest question for all the businesses that then read this was not, are we impacting nature? It's like, okay, great. You've told us in this big, thick report that we are really impacting nature. What do we do about it? Like, how can we do anything about it? And you have much more complicated mechanisms. If you build a factory here, it's not like you emit carbon here, you buy some credits there. It's kind of balanced out in the global atmosphere, and there's a level of regionality, but it's pretty much fungible. But you can't be like, right, we're going to build a factory in Middlesex in England, and then in exchange we're going to protect some forests in Tasmania. That doesn't make sense. To bioregional impact is different, and so a huge amount of thinking is going into that. That's the bit that I think is the big unsolved problem.
Okay.
My belief in it is we don't have time to debate massively on a lot of that stuff, and also that plays to the hands of the people who don't want to debate it in the first place. They just keep creating confusion and making it, well, that science isn't right, and it's like science is never settled. I think it's important to get intention, and that's why I think the ecological benefits framework, the EBF, which is an initiative I've been involved with for the last 6 months to a year, is really powerful, because what it does is it creates a framework around each ton of carbon that more demonstrably categorizes co-benefits in a way that you can then create some comparison between projects that are selling credits, but also gives you the ability to choose credits that are better suited to the non-carbon effects that you're trying to mitigate as a business. And maybe there's some brand in there as well. There's some marketing side as well, because I've heard of companies doing 90 days of due diligence on carbon right now because they want to buy offsets, because they deeply want to be responsible, but they also don't want to buy offsets that aren't authentic and can't be stood by.
Absolutely.
Right? And that's insane.
But we have this problem ourselves. I mean, we buy carbon credits, but every time we do it, there's this little voice in the back of my head going, oh,
how legit are these?
How legit is it? Is this going to become a PR nightmare when the carbon credits that we bought, the organization that we bought them for, gets touted out in the news as XYZ, and we're supposed to have these commitments, but apparently we didn't do enough due diligence in order to know better. Of course, as a leader in a business, you're stuck with these considerations all the time.
Yes.
And so I understand it intimately, and I don't want to waste my time on it. So We do
Well,
the
if you'd
best we
like
can
some
and we move
top
on,
quality premium
and we're
carbon
waiting
credits,
for
we
the
can talk
next
about that.
generation.
Sorry, I talked to
Yeah, we
you.
did the same thing. Yeah. I just said we do the best we can and we wait for the next generation of things that are clearly
Yes.
a better solution.
And all I was saying was, if you'd like a source of real high quality carbon credits, I can talk to you about that. That's not a
Yes.
problem.
Great.
But it's that I think that's the biggest problem. And I'm talking to some very, very bright people, much more intelligent than me in all of these spaces right now, who are all desperately trying to create methodologies to solve this. But I personally think the key is in packaging. And that may sound kind of a bit trite and a bit commercial, but it goes right back to what we started at the beginning when I was talking about being able to ingrain a picture of a grizzly bear as an indicator of an apex predator in an ecosystem that therefore signified a healthy biodiversity system. If you could ingrain that image into the credit that you've sold, that's carbon credit, and then you can package and market that credit direct to the consumer, because that again is what technology allows you to do. With ingrained due diligence, you go straight to consumer, maximize the revenue back down into communities, which is a huge part of what we do. Like the vast majority of our revenues go into the indigenous communities. If you can package that up in a way that gives a business leader like yourself the ability to say, I can stand by this because I have line of sight of the ground truth in that credit. And if that what the EBF framework is all about is that credit, you can then demonstrably see the impact on benefiting air pollution, benefiting water pollution, or improving soil quality, high levels of equity and biodiversity protection is the six categories that the EBF works on. Then you get to be able to stand by that because it's a level of due diligence, and you don't. It's peace of mind, right? That's what you want to buy. And I'm having this discussion all the time, specifically around that's how you can justify a premium price for a carbon credit, because you're reducing the due diligence cost at your client side. And so that's why some clients are willing to pay very good money for carbon credits, because they are literally outsourcing that responsibility by buying a premium credit that they know they'll be able to stand behind, not because they think it's a good one, but because they can actually literally see it. It's tangible
Right.
and it's deliverable. And they
Right.
can
The trust
track it.
comes with transparency is basically what you're saying.
It's Web3, right? Like, it's why Web3 is so critical to the regenerative space, is because what the carbon market as one element of the regenerative space, one key revenue stream of the regenerative space has been crying out for, is a greater ability to guarantee that it's not being double sold, ledgers. It's where it's come from is where you say it is, authenticity, ingrained due diligence. It's literally, it ticks every box: provenance, authenticity, transparency, liquidity. It's all of the tick boxes for what the
Well,
carbon.
and with the model that you're creating, the control at the local levels.
Yes. Yeah. And because really our product isn't, one of our products is carbon, but actually that's the secondary product. Our product is the ability to invest in the ecosystem itself, or the relationship with the ecosystem itself, and that kind of revised relationship between humanity and the forest. And so when we've secured that ecosystem with a high degree of permanence with huge levels of equity with the local community, our role, then our secondary role as a network, becomes, okay, now we've secured that ecosystem, how do we get the best return for the investors who've invested in that protected forest partnership and the communities that are in partnership with them? How do we get the best returns for them? Well, the answer to that is by serving up the best quality credits to a client base for the lowest cost of creation. Web3, again, lower marginal cost of additional product creation. And you then also say, right, and how do we give all the solutions they can to ground truth those credits so that we can lead that all the way up to the sales? That's how we create the premium price point. So, that's why I say packaging, I think, is key to it all, because ultimately it's that ability to sit down with I use this example sometimes. It might sound a bit trite, but if you can sell carbon credits to Jaguar Land Rover that have got apex predator identification ingrained into them, and that apex predator is a jaguar in a Colombian rainforest, they're going to pay a premium for that, right? And if their Land Rover division wants ones that come out of Africa and are linked to, because that's aligned with their brand proposition, where you've suddenly created ways to create premium value, brand value for your eco credits. I don't like to call them carbon because I think they're much more than that by the time you get to that point. And I think it's the hard problem to solve, but I think it's solvable. I think there's interesting developments for it.
All right, so I'm gonna go back to the beginning, to the lightheartedness part of the conversation that we're talking about, because we've actually been really pragmatic, right? Like a lot, and it is what I love. But my last question really is like, okay, so if you could wave a magic wand and change one thing about the environment in which you're doing this work and the challenges you're experiencing, what would it be?
Wow, that is a really good question. I think it's a mindset change. I think it's just the magic wand is for people to just get that they can hold value in the other end of that pole, that the world isn't all about extraction and the financial system doesn't have to be centric to that. And it's the mindset that I want the light bulb to go off. That's the magic wand. I want everybody's light bulb to go off and go, oh, I can hold value in this new thing that's actually deeply ingrained with everything I love. And I know I love it because I walk in it. Like I heard the other day, 80% of people have nature as their screensaver. We love this planet. We know intrinsically at a cellular level that these assets that currently have no standing in our current economic system are the most valuable assets that we have on the planet. We know it. We know it in our soul when we breathe the air, when we walk amongst the trees. And the magic one for me would be for people to go, oh, I can engage in that in an economic way and that's super empowering. When I talk about what we're doing to people at Christmas time around the family table, whatever, and people are like, Pete, what are you doing? What crazy stuff are you up to now? And I tell them one of the most super inspiring things back to me is how empowered those people feel suddenly in this meta crisis of craziness. They're like, hang on, I can take my value, my money out of my bank account where I know it's being leveraged and lent to extractive companies, and I can take it out and I can put it into the trees and the indigenous communities that are going to steward and regenerate them. It's a relief because suddenly you can play a part, not in a trite, you've bought something in a shop that somebody's planted a tree for, but in a genuine, direct way that you can impact and see that impact and also connect with nature. We've all become so disconnected from nature, and our systems and paradigms have accentuated that. And I think we all desperately, don't we, just want to reconnect and actually feel like we're part of this ecosystem, because we are. We forget it a lot. We have this kind of Victorian mindset of nature and then me. You are nature. So, that's the magic one for me. It's a mindset change. It's not a specific thing. It's not a legislative thing or whatever. If you have the mindset change, you don't need to worry about the legislative change because it will just happen. You don't need to coordinate everybody if you've already got an intention that is held between everybody. And so there's my magic wand. There's my lighthearted magic wand. Have everybody know what they already know, that we are part of nature. It is part of us. We love it, and we have a mechanism by which we can invest in it.
That's fabulous. Thank you.